Woman cleans millionaire's house, then finds her wedding photo in his room. The sound of her worn sneakers scuffed against the marble floors as Emily adjusted the weight of her cleaning bucket, balancing it carefully on her hip. It wasn't her first time cleaning an opulent mansion, but something about this one left her more than a little awestruck. The chandelier overhead sparkled with such intensity that it felt like it might outshine the sun. Each corner of the sprawling entryway seemed to gleam with an otherworldly perfection, the kind of shine that could only be maintained by an army of housekeepers like her. Emily wasn't sure if she was impressed or slightly annoyed by it all. She tightened her grip on the mop handle, pausing for a moment to glance at the massive portrait hanging over the curved staircase. It was a painting of a man, tall and well-dressed, his sharp jawline softened only slightly by the faintest trace of a smile. His eyes seemed to follow her as she moved across the room, giving her the unsettling sense that he might step out of the frame at any moment. She quickly looked away and focused on the task at hand. Emily had taken this job because, frankly, she had no other choice. After months of struggling to make ends meet, she was willing to clean just about anything if it meant keeping food on the table and the lights on in her tiny apartment. But this house? This was something else. It wasn't just the size of it, though that was intimidating enough. It was the feeling it gave her, like she didn't belong here, not even as part of the hired help. Pushing those thoughts aside, she got to work scrubbing the baseboards, her movements methodical as she focused on the repetitive motion. Her mind drifted to her daughter, Lily, who was at home with a sitter. Lily had asked her that morning why Mommy had to go to work on a Saturday. Emily had kissed her forehead and promised they'd spend all of Sunday together, just the two of them. She'd meant it too, even though she knew she'd be exhausted by the time the weekend was over. As Emily moved through the house, she couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. For such a massive home, it felt almost empty. The other staff seemed to keep to themselves, flitting in and out of rooms like ghosts. She hadn't seen the owner yet, though she'd been told he rarely interacted with the cleaning crew. That was fine with her. She preferred to keep her head down and get her work done without any unnecessary drama. Still, there was something about this house that made her uneasy. It wasn't just the eerie quiet or the way the luxurious furniture seemed almost too perfect, like it had never been touched. It was the subtle sense that she'd been here before, though she knew that wasn't possible. Shaking off the thought, Emily carried her bucket into the next room. This one was a library, and it took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, filled with books that looked like they'd never been opened. A massive window let in streams of golden sunlight, illuminating the rich mahogany furniture and the plush Persian rug beneath her feet. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, feeling like she might somehow disturb the peace of the space just by being there. She set her bucket down and began dusting the shelves, her fingers brushing lightly against the spines of the books. Some of them had titles in languages she didn't recognize, their leather covers embossed with gold lettering that glinted in the light. She wondered briefly if the owner had actually read any of them or if they were just for show. Either way, it didn't matter to her. She had a job to do. As she reached for a book on the top shelf, a faint noise caught her attention. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the distance. Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat as she strained to listen. But the sound didn't come again, and she told herself it was probably just the old house settling. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. After finishing in the library, Emily made her way upstairs. The second floor was even more extravagant than the first, with marble statues and intricate tapestries adorning the hallways. She moved carefully, not wanting to knock anything over. Each step she took seemed to echo in the vast space, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings and making her feel even smaller than she already did. She was just about to start on one of the guest bedrooms when she noticed a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, which were all open, this one was closed. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She'd been told to clean every room, but something about this door made her pause. It wasn't locked, but the weight of it felt heavier than it should, as if it were holding back more than just air. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything she'd seen in the rest of the house. It was smaller, cozier, with a single bed and a wooden desk that looked worn with age. The walls were lined with photographs, most of them in black and white. Emily stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room as a strange sense of familiarity washed over her. It wasn't until she reached the desk that she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked up the frame, her hands trembling. It was a photograph of her wedding day, the edges slightly worn but the image unmistakable. She stared at the picture, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. How was this possible? Who in this house could have her wedding photo, and why? Emily's legs felt weak, and she sank into the chair by the desk, the frame still clutched tightly in her hands. Memories of that day flooded back to her. The joy, the love, the promises made. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by betrayal and heartbreak. She tried so hard to move on, to build a new life for herself and Lily, but seeing this photo brought it all rushing back. Her hands shook as she set the frame down, her mind spinning with questions. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear, she couldn't leave this room without finding answers. Emily sat in stunned silence, her fingers trembling as they rested on the edges of the photograph. She stared at the smiling faces in the picture, hers and her ex-husband's. It was the same photo that used to sit proudly on the mantel in their old home, a time when life felt perfect, before everything crumbled. The weight of the memory pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The room felt smaller, suffocating even. She looked around again, desperate to find some clue, something that would explain why this photo, her photo, was here, in this stranger's house. Her eyes scanned the walls, the desk, the carefully arranged trinkets on the shelves. The space was intimate, filled with personal items that seemed oddly mismatched with the grandeur of the rest of the mansion. A soft knock at the door startled her. She jumped to her feet, instinctively hiding the photo behind her back. The door creaked open, and an older man in a butler's uniform stepped inside. His expression was calm, professional, but his sharp eyes quickly noticed Emily's flushed face and the way she clutched something behind her. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, his voice measured and polite, though there was a note of curiosity in it. Emily forced a tight smile, her mind racing. I was just cleaning. I didn't mean to come in here." The door wasn't locked. The butler's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and she felt as though he could see right through her. "This room isn't usually accessed by the cleaning staff," he said carefully. "It's a private space." "I'm sorry," Emily stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I didn't know." The butler's eyes flicked to her hands, still gripping the frame behind her. "Is there something you found?" Emily hesitated. Her first instinct was to deny it, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. But the words wouldn't come. She felt a surge of defiance, an uncharacteristic need for answers that pushed past her usual tendency to stay quiet and avoid trouble. I found this," she said, slowly bringing the photograph into view. The butler's face betrayed a flicker of recognition, but he quickly masked it with his usual composed demeanor. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why is this here?" "This is my photo." The butler straightened, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I believe it would be best if you discussed this matter with Mr. Donovan," he said. "He will have the answers you're looking for." "Mr. Donovan?" Emily repeated, her confusion deepening. "The owner of this house?" "Yes," the butler confirmed. "I'll let him know you'd like to speak with him." Before Emily could protest or ask more questions, the butler turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the photograph and her swirling thoughts. She sank back into the chair, her mind racing. Mr. Donovan. The name didn't ring any bells, but something about this entire situation felt too strange to be a coincidence. Minutes later, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, growing louder as they approached. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She clutched the photograph tightly, her palms sweating. The door swung open, and a man stepped inside. It was him, the man from the portrait in the entryway. Tall, impeccably dressed, with an air of confidence that filled the room. But now, up close, Emily noticed something else. His face wasn't just handsome and refined, it was familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man's piercing blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, the confident mask he wore slipped. "Emily," he said, his voice soft but filled with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite place. Emily stood, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand. What is going on? Why do you have this photo? Why are you here?" Daniel stepped further into the room, his gaze fixed on her. "I should have told you sooner," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "But I didn't know how to reach you. I didn't know if you'd even want to see me." "Reach me?" Emily repeated, her voice rising. "You disappeared, Daniel. You left without a word. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To us?" Daniel flinched at her words, the guilt evident in his expression. "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I've carried that regret with me every day since." Emily shook her head, anger and confusion bubbling to the surface. "That doesn't explain this," she said, holding up the photograph. "Why do you have this? Why am I even here, cleaning your house? Did you plan this?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I didn't plan for you to end up here, not like this," he admitted. "But when I realized it was you, I didn't stop it either." Emily's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I recognized your name on the cleaning roster," Daniel said. "When the agency sent over the list of staff, I saw it. I couldn't believe it. After all these years." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean to tell me you knew I was coming here, and you didn't say anything? You just let me walk in here like a fool, not knowing anything?" Daniel took a step closer, his expression earnest. "I didn't know how to approach you, Emily. I thought maybe if you saw me, if we had the chance to talk." "Talk about what?" she snapped. "You vanished, Daniel. You left me to pick up the pieces of our life while you, what? Became a millionaire and moved into a mansion?" "It wasn't like that," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Things weren't as simple as they seemed back then." Emily laughed bitterly. "Of course they weren't. They never are they? But you know what was simple? The fact that you left. You left me and Lily, and we had to fend for ourselves." At the mention of their daughter, Daniel's expression shifted, a flash of pain crossing his face. "How is she?" he asked softly. "Don't," Emily said, her voice breaking. "You don't get to ask about her. You don't get to care now, after everything." Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Emily's hands trembled as she held the photograph, the weight of the past pressing down on her like a tidal wave. She wanted answers, but more than that, she wanted to understand why fate had brought her here, to this house, to this man she had tried so hard to forget. "I think you should leave," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I don't want to talk to you right now." Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to argue. But then he nodded, stepping back toward the door. "I'll give you space," he said. "But Emily, please, don't shut me out completely. There's so much I need to tell you." She didn't respond, turning her back to him as tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She heard the door close softly behind him, and then she was alone again. Alone with her thoughts, her anger, and the photograph that had brought her world crashing down around her. Emily sat frozen for a long moment after Daniel left, her breath shallow and her thoughts spinning out of control. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around her as if the weight of her past was pressing against her from all sides. The photograph in her hands, once a cherished memory, now felt like a cruel taunt. She set it down on the desk with trembling hands, unable to look at it any longer. Her mind raced with questions, each more frustrating than the last. Why had Daniel disappeared all those years ago? How had he gone from the man she thought she knew to this wealthy stranger living in a mansion that felt like it belonged in a fairy tale? And, most importantly, what did he want from her now? Emily clenched her fists, a surge of anger rising within her. She had spent years rebuilding her life from the ruins he had left behind. She had been the one to comfort Lily when she cried, the one to scrape by on meager paychecks, the one to face the judgment of others who whispered behind her back about the man who had abandoned her. She had done it all alone, and now, Daniel had the audacity to appear as though he could explain it all away? The thought made her stand abruptly, her body buzzing with restless energy. She needed to get out of this room, away from the memories that threatened to consume her. Grabbing her cleaning supplies, she stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind her as if to shut out everything it represented. The long corridor stretched before her, silent and pristine. She glanced around, half expecting to see the butler lurking nearby, but the space was empty. Emily took a deep breath and started walking, her steps echoing faintly on the polished floors. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to move, to think. As she wandered, her thoughts kept circling back to Daniel's expression when he had asked about Lily. There had been genuine pain in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't seen in him before. It unsettled her, made her wonder if he truly regretted the choices he had made. But even if he did that change anything? Did it erase the years of hurt he had caused? Emily's wandering brought her to another grand room, this one a sitting area with massive windows that bathed the space in warm sunlight. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes drawn to the view outside. The sprawling gardens stretched as far as the eye could see, their manicured hedges and vibrant flowers a stark contrast to the chaotic tangle of emotions inside her. For a moment, she stood there, letting the beauty of the scene calm her racing heart. But the tranquility was short-lived. A sound behind her made her turn sharply, her pulse quickening. Daniel stood in the doorway, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored trousers. He looked hesitant, almost unsure of himself, a stark difference from the confident man she had seen earlier. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice quiet. I thought we should talk." Emily crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze hard. "I don't think there's anything to talk about." "There is," Daniel insisted, stepping into the room. "You deserve answers, Emily. You deserve to know the truth about why I left." She shook her head, bitterness seeping into her voice. "What difference does it make now? You left. You made your choice. Knowing why won't change anything." "It might," Daniel said, his tone earnest. "Please, just let me explain." Emily hesitated, her resolve wavering. She didn't want to hear his excuses, but a part of her, a small, stubborn part, needed to understand. She needed to know if the man she had loved had been as cruel and selfish as she had believed, or if there was something more to the story. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "Talk. But don't expect me to forgive you." Daniel nodded, stepping further into the room. He gestured to one of the chairs, but Emily remained standing, her arms still crossed. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and began. "When I left, it wasn't because I wanted to," he said, his voice low. "It was because I thought I had to." Emily raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "Had to? What does that even mean?" "It means that I made a mistake," Daniel admitted. "A terrible mistake. I got involved with the wrong people, trusted the wrong advice. I thought I was protecting you and Lily by walking away, but all I did was hurt you both." Emily's jaw tightened, her anger flaring again. "You thought leaving us would protect us? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "I know it sounds ridiculous," Daniel said quickly. "But you have to understand, Emily. I was in over my head. There were debts, threats, things I didn't want to bring into your life. I thought if I left, you'd be safe." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. "Debts? Threats? What kind of life were you living?" Daniel hesitated, his eyes dropping to the floor. "It wasn't the life I wanted," he said quietly. "But I made mistakes and I paid for them. After I left, I worked to rebuild myself, to become someone who could fix what I broke. That's how I ended up here." Emily let out a hollow laugh. "So you rebuilt yourself into a millionaire? Must be nice." "It wasn't easy," Daniel said, his voice firm. "And it wasn't without regret. Every day, I thought about you and Lily. About what I'd lost. I wanted to come back, but I didn't know how." "You didn't know how?" Emily repeated, her voice rising. "You pick up the phone, Daniel. You write a letter. You don't just disappear and expect us to move on like you never existed." "I know," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "And I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension between them almost palpable. Emily looked away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She hated how his apology stirred something in her, a tiny spark of the love she had once felt for him. But that love had been buried under years of anger and pain, and she wasn't ready to let it surface. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, his expression solemn. "I don't expect you to. But I want to try to make things right. For Lily." Emily's heart ached at the mention of her daughter. She thought of all the times Lily had asked about her father, all the lies Emily had told to protect her from the truth. Could she really let Daniel back into their lives after everything? "I need time," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't do this right now." "I understand," Daniel said. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Emily didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the room, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: her life had just become far more complicated. The evening descended upon the mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors as the golden light of the sun faded into a cool, dim hue. Emily paced the length of the small guest room the butler had shown her to earlier, unable to sit still. She hadn't planned on staying here overnight, but after everything that had unfolded, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. Her mind felt like a whirlwind, memories, emotions, and unanswered questions all fighting for dominance. The soft knock on her door startled her, and for a brief moment, she considered ignoring it. But curiosity won out. When she opened it, she found the butler standing there, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Mr. Donovan thought you might like some tea," he said, his tone even and professional. He gestured to the tray he carried, complete with a steaming teapot and a delicate porcelain cup. Emily hesitated. Tea wasn't going to fix anything, but it was better than sitting alone in silence. She stepped aside to let him in, though she couldn't quite meet his eyes. The butler placed the tray on the small table by the window and turned to her. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Emily mumbled, and he nodded before slipping quietly out of the room. Emily sat at the table, her hands cradling the warm cup as she stared out the window. The gardens below were bathed in silver moonlight, their beauty undiminished by the darkness. It felt surreal being here in this house, with Daniel just a few doors away. She had spent so many nights imagining what she would say to him if she ever saw him again, but now that the moment had come, she felt lost. Her thoughts drifted to Lily. She had called the sitter earlier, making up an excuse about being stuck at work and promising to explain everything tomorrow. Lily had been understanding as always, but Emily couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. Her daughter deserved better than this, better than the uncertainty and the ghosts of a past Emily had tried so hard to leave behind. Setting the cup down, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Memories of her life with Daniel flooded her mind. The way he used to make her laugh with his terrible jokes, the way he'd hold her when the world felt too heavy, the way he'd looked at her on their wedding day as if she were the only person in the world. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the man who had left her without a word, who had built a life for himself while she struggled to survive. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in thought, but the sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled her back to the present. She stiffened, expecting another knock on her door, but the steps passed by without pause. For some reason, that made her heart ache even more. The tea had gone cold by the time Emily finally crawled into bed. She stared up at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a lead blanket. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, it brought dreams of a life that no longer existed. The morning light streaming through the window woke her far too early. Emily groaned and pulled the blanket over her head, but the sharp knock on her door forced her to sit up. She rubbed her eyes, her mind still foggy with sleep as she called out, "Come in." The door opened, and there he was, Daniel, looking far too put together for someone who had probably slept just as little as she had. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression a mix of determination and uncertainty. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than she expected. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "What do you want, Daniel?" "I thought we could talk," he said. "Properly this time. No interruptions, no half-truths. Just everything." She stared at him, her first instinct to shut him down. but the earnest look in his eyes gave her pause. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or maybe it was the tiny part of her that still wanted answers, but she nodded. "Fine," she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "But I'm not promising anything." Daniel stepped aside to let her pass, and together they walked down the hallway in silence. He led her to a small breakfast nook, a cozy room that felt worlds away from the grandeur of the rest of the house. The table was already set with plates of fresh fruit, pastries, and coffee, but Emily barely glanced at it as she sat down. Daniel poured her a cup of coffee and slid it across the table before taking the seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. "I don't even know where to start," Daniel said finally, his voice low. "How about the truth?" Emily said sharply. "Start with that?" He nodded, his gaze dropping to the cup in his hands. "When I left, it wasn't because I didn't love you. I need you to know that. I loved you, Emily. I still do." Her stomach twisted at his words, but she kept her expression neutral. "Then why did you leave? Why didn't you fight for us?" Daniel took a deep breath, his hands tightening around the cup. "I made mistakes. I trusted people I shouldn't have. I got involved in business deals that went south, and I ended up owing money to people who don't take kindly to unpaid debts." Emily's brow furrowed. "You never told me any of this." "I didn't want to burden you," he said. "I thought I could fix it on my own, but things spiraled out of control. They started making threats, against me, against you and Lily. I thought if I left, they'd leave you alone." Her heart ached at the thought of the danger they had been in, but her anger burned brighter. "You should have trusted me," she said. "We could have figured it out together." "I know," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I know that now. But back then I was scared. I thought I was protecting you." "And what about Lily?" Emily demanded. "Do you have any idea how many nights she cried herself to sleep, asking where her daddy was? Do you know how many lies I had to tell to make her feel okay?" Daniel's shoulders sagged, his face pale. "I can never make up for what I did to her," he said. "But I want to try. If you'll let me, I want to be part of her life again." Emily's chest tightened, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he didn't deserve that chance. But she also thought of Lily and the joy she would feel at having her father back, even if he didn't deserve her forgiveness. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally. "Not after everything." "I'll earn it," Daniel said, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes, I'll earn it." Emily stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and hope. She didn't know if she could believe him, but for Lily's sake, she had to at least try. Emily sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, her eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of her. The steam had long since dissipated, but she couldn't bring herself to lift it. Daniel's words echoed in her mind, stirring emotions she'd buried deep down for years. The weight of his confession sat heavy in her chest, but no amount of regret or sorrow from him could erase what had been done. "I don't even know where to start," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd moved on. I thought I was okay with you being gone. But now..." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Emily. I know I don't deserve it. But I couldn't let this chance pass me by. I couldn't see your name and not try to make things right." She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "Do you really think you can make things right? After all these years?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm willing to try. For you and for Lily." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to believe him, but the walls she'd built around herself wouldn't crumble so easily. She'd spent too long piecing her life back together, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, least of all the man who had abandoned her. "What exactly do you want from me, Daniel?" she asked, her tone sharper now. "You say you want to make things right, but what does that even mean? Do you think you can just walk back into my life and act like nothing happened?" "No," he said quickly. "I don't want to pretend everything's fine. I know it's not. I know I hurt you, and I know I have a long way to go before I can even begin to make up for it. But I want to be here for Lily. I want to be the father she deserves." Emily's heart clenched at the mention of their daughter. Lily had asked about Daniel less and less as the years went on, But there were still moments when Emily saw the longing in her eyes, the unspoken questions she was too afraid to ask. Could she really deny her daughter the chance to know her father? And could she handle letting Daniel back into their lives, knowing the risk he posed to her fragile sense of stability? "I need to think about it," she said, standing abruptly. "This is too much, Daniel. I need time." He nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." Emily left the room without another word, her footsteps echoing in the quiet mansion. She wandered aimlessly through the halls, her thoughts a tangled mess. Part of her wanted to leave, to walk out the front door and never look back. But another part, the part she tried to ignore, felt drawn to stay. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. She found herself back in the library, the place that had first struck her with its eerie beauty. The rows of books seemed endless, each one a portal to another world. She traced her fingers along the spines, their leather bindings cool and smooth under her touch. It was a distraction, however brief, from the turmoil within her. As she reached the far end of the room, she noticed a small table tucked into the corner. On it sat a collection of framed photographs. Curious, she stepped closer, her breath catching as she recognized one of the images. It was a picture of Lily, no older than 3, sitting on a park bench with a stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. Emily remembered that day vividly. It had been one of the rare moments of peace during an otherwise chaotic time. But how did Daniel have this photo? She had never shared it with anyone, had never even printed it out herself. Her mind raced as she looked at the other photos on the table. Some were of her, others of Lily, and a few of all 3 of them together, back when they had been a family. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a window into a life she had tried so hard to forget. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the frames, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. She felt a mixture of anger and sadness, a sense of betrayal mingled with the faintest glimmer of hope. Daniel had kept these photos all these years. But was it guilt? Nostalgia? Or something more? "Emily." She turned sharply, the frame still in her hands. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up the photo. "Why do you have these?" He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "I kept them because they were all I had left of you and Lily. When I left, I didn't take much with me, but I couldn't leave these behind." "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why keep them if you didn't care enough to stay?" "I cared," he said, his voice firm. "I've always cared, but I was too much of a coward to face my mistakes. Keeping those photos was my way of holding on to the only good thing I ever had." Emily shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't get to say that, Daniel. You don't get to act like you're some tragic figure who had no choice. You had a choice, and you chose to leave." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I regret it every day. But I'm here now, Emily. I'm trying to make it right." She turned away from him, setting the photo back on the table with trembling hands. "It's not that simple." "I know it's not," he said. "But I'm not going anywhere this time. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Emily closed her eyes, willing herself to stay strong. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that people could change. But trust wasn't something she could give so easily, not after everything she'd been through. "You've got a long way to go," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I'll walk it," he said. "As long as it takes." The weight of the conversation hung in the air long after Daniel left the library. Emily felt drained, as though the sheer act of revisiting the past had sapped her of all energy. She lingered by the table of photographs, her fingers brushing lightly against the frames. The images stared back at her, frozen moments of a life she had tried to forget but never truly let go of. She wondered what Daniel had done over the years, how he had managed to build such a lavish life after leaving her and Lily behind. The mansion, the wealth, the butler, all of it felt surreal, like a cruel joke being played on her. And yet, as much as she wanted to hate him, there was a part of her that still ached for the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. The sound of footsteps in the hallway jolted her from her thoughts. She turned to see the butler approaching, his expression composed but gentle. "Miss Emily," he said, his voice low and soothing, "Mr. Donovan thought you might like some fresh air. The gardens are particularly lovely this time of day." Emily hesitated, unsure if she wanted to follow his suggestion or retreat back to the guest room to sort through her thoughts alone. But the thought of being confined to the walls of the mansion any longer made her chest tighten. She nodded, grabbing her coat from the chair beside her. "Thank you," she said softly. The butler led her through the grand hallways and out onto a stone patio that overlooked the sprawling gardens. Emily stepped out into the crisp morning air, her lungs filling with the faint scent of roses and freshly cut grass. The gardens were even more breathtaking up close, a labyrinth of vibrant blooms and carefully trimmed hedges that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. She wandered aimlessly, letting the peacefulness of the space wash over her. It was easy to get lost here, both physically and mentally. The chaos of the mansion and the emotional storm brewing within her seemed to fade with each step she took along the winding paths. But even in the beauty of the moment, her mind remained restless, circling back to Daniel and the impossible questions he had left her with. As she rounded a corner, she found herself in a small, secluded courtyard. A single bench sat beneath the shade of a towering oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. She sat down, her hands resting on her lap as she gazed up at the leaves above. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Emily jumped, her heart skipping a beat as she turned to see Daniel standing a few feet away. She hadn't heard him approach, but there he was, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat as he studied her with a quiet intensity. "You really need to stop sneaking up on me," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm sorry," he said, though a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I just thought you might want some company." Emily sighed, her gaze returning to the tree above. "I'm not sure what I want right now." Daniel took that as an invitation to sit, lowering himself onto the bench beside her but leaving a respectful amount of space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. "You used to love sitting under trees like this," Daniel said quietly. "Back when we lived in that little house with the big oak tree in the yard. You'd bring Lily out with you and read to her while she played in the grass." Emily's chest tightened at the memory. She could still picture those afternoons vividly, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of Lily's laughter ringing through the air. They had been happy then, or at least she thought they had. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Daniel nodded. "It feels like a lifetime." Emily turned to him, her brows furrowed. "Why are you doing this, Daniel? Why now?" "Because I couldn't stay away anymore," he said simply. "I've spent years convincing myself that I was doing the right thing by staying out of your life, but the truth is, I was just afraid. Afraid of facing you, of facing what I'd done. But when I saw your name on that cleaning roster, it felt like fate was giving me a second chance." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Fate? You think fate put me in this position? Do you know how hard it's been, Daniel? How many nights I've gone to bed worrying about how I'm going to pay the bills or keep a roof over Lily's head? That's not fate. That's survival." "I know," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I hate that I wasn't there to help you. I hate that I made things harder for you. But I want to help now, Emily. I want to make things right." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "Throw some money at the problem? Buy us a better life and hope that makes up for everything?" "No," he said firmly. "I know money can't fix what I've done. But it can make things a little easier for you and Lily. It can give you the stability you deserve." Emily shook her head, her emotions warring within her. "I don't want your money, Daniel. I want to know that you're not going to disappear again the moment things get tough." "I won't," he said, his voice resolute. "I swear to you, Emily, I'm here for the long haul. Whatever it takes, I'll prove it to you." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was sincerity, a raw vulnerability that she hadn't seen in him before. It scared her, the idea of letting him back into her life, of opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again. But it also stirred something deep within her, a small flicker of hope that she couldn't quite extinguish. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But for Lily's sake, I'm willing to try." Daniel's expression softened, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's all I can ask for." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. Emily still had doubts, still had fears. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The next few days at the mansion passed in a strange rhythm. Emily stayed on, despite her initial urge to leave, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was because of Lily, because deep down she knew her daughter deserved the chance to know her father. Or perhaps it was the lingering sense of curiosity that tethered her to this place, the need to understand who Daniel had become after all these years. Daniel, for his part, seemed determined to prove himself. He didn't push her for answers or forgiveness, instead giving her the space she needed while making small gestures that she couldn't entirely ignore. Fresh flowers appeared in her guest room one morning, their scent filling the space with an unexpected warmth. A book she had mentioned offhandedly appeared on the bedside table, its pages pristine and waiting for her to open them. It was infuriating, in a way, how thoughtful he was being. Emily didn't want to soften toward him, didn't want to let her guard down. But the walls she had built around herself seemed less sturdy with each passing day. On the third morning, she found herself back in the garden, wandering the maze of hedges and blooming flowers. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn morning that carried a slight chill but promised warmth as the sun rose higher. She didn't notice Daniel approaching until he was just a few feet away, his footsteps quiet on the stone path. "Morning," he said, his tone gentle. Emily turned to face him, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Morning." He hesitated, as if weighing whether to speak further, before gesturing toward the bench they had shared a few days ago. "Mind if I join you?" She considered saying no, but something in his expression stopped her. With a small nod, she sat down on the bench, leaving space for him to sit beside her. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day. It's about trust." Emily glanced at him but didn't reply. She didn't need to, the weight of her silence was enough to encourage him to continue. "I know I can't erase the past," he said, his gaze fixed on the ground. "But I want to start over. Not just with you, but with Lily. I want to be the kind of father she can rely on, the kind of man you don't have to second-guess." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "You think it's that simple? That you can just decide to start over, and everything will magically be fine?" "No," Daniel admitted. "I know it's not simple, but I have to try. For Lily's sake, if nothing else." His words hit her harder than she expected. She thought of Lily, of the countless times her daughter had asked about her father with that hopeful look in her eyes. Emily had always found ways to deflect, to protect Lily from the truth. But maybe she had been wrong to shield her so completely. Maybe Lily deserved to know the man who had hurt them both. And maybe, just maybe, Daniel deserved a chance to prove himself. "She doesn't even remember you," Emily said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "She was so young when you left. To her, you're just a story I don't tell." Daniel's face fell, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I want to change that," he said. "I know it won't be easy, but I'll do whatever it takes to earn her trust." Emily sighed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "You don't get to just walk back into her life and play the hero, Daniel. She's been through enough without you confusing her." "I'm not trying to confuse her," he said. "I just want to be there for her. To show her that I care." "And what happens when things get hard?" Emily asked, her voice rising slightly. "What happens when she starts asking questions you can't answer, or when she needs more than you're willing to give? Are you going to leave again?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "I won't. I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, but I swear to you, Emily, I'm not going anywhere this time." She wanted to believe him, but the scars he had left behind were too deep, too raw. Trust wasn't something she could offer lightly, not after everything. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to decide right now," Daniel said gently. "Take your time. I'll wait as long as it takes." That evening, Emily sat in her guest room, the curtains drawn and the room dimly lit by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. She stared at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had promised herself she wouldn't call Lily until she was sure of what to say, but the guilt of keeping her daughter in the dark was eating away at her. With a deep breath, she dialed the sitter's number. The phone rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. "Hi, Miss Emily. Lily's just finishing up dinner. Want me to put her on?" "Yes, please," Emily said, her voice tight. "Thank you." A moment later, Lily's voice came through the line, bright and excited. "Hi, Mommy." "Hi, sweetie," Emily said, her heart aching at the sound of her daughter's voice. "How are you?" "Good. I made a drawing for you today. It's a surprise, but I'll show you when you get home." Emily smiled, though tears pricked at her eyes. "I can't wait to see it. I'll be home soon, I promise." "But are you still cleaning that big house?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice wavering. "It's a very big house." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Lily spoke again, her tone was curious. "Mommy, do you think Daddy lives in a big house like that?" The question hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She gripped the phone tightly, her breath catching in her throat. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" "I don't know," Lily said. "I was just wondering." Emily closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. "I don't know, Lily. But maybe someday we'll talk about Daddy, okay?" "Okay," Lily said, her voice soft. "I love you, Mommy." "I love you too, baby," Emily whispered. "So much." After hanging up, Emily sat in silence, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She thought of Lily's innocent question and the longing that had been so clear in her voice. How could she deny her daughter the chance to know her father when it was so clear she wanted to? But the fear remained, the fear of letting Daniel back into their lives only for him to disappear again. Emily wasn't sure her heart, or Lily's, could survive that. She wiped at her eyes and stood, pacing the room as she tried to make sense of her swirling thoughts. The decision felt impossible, but one thing was clear: she couldn't avoid it forever. At some point, she would have to face the truth and decide whether to let Daniel back into their lives for good.